together. Adoption brings our worlds together. Adoption brings our worlds together. Come and share with me. Adoption brings our worlds together. Adoption brings our worlds together. Adoption brings our worlds together. Come and share with me. Share with me. Adoption brings our worlds together. Adoption brings our worlds together. Adoption brings our worlds together. Come and share with me. Adoption brings our worlds together. Adoption brings our worlds together. Adoption brings our worlds together. Come and share with me. Share with me. Welcome to the Journey to Josiah Podcast. I'm your host, David D. Marshall, founder and CEO of Journey to Josiah Incorporated. I am extremely excited to have as my guest Allison Clark. Ms. Clark began her career as a child protection services social worker for the Connecticut Department of Children and Families. She worked in specialized units, including medically complex / high-risk newborns, mental health adolescents, and permanency, working directly with parents and children, as well as other professionals in law enforcement, schools, hospitals, and the judicial system. In 2013, Ms. Clark transferred to the Foster and Adoption Services Division of DCF, where she was a licensing and support worker for adoptive families and a trainer. In 2018, after relocating to Maryland, Ms. Clark joined Paths for Families as the foster care adoption specialist. In this role, she is the trainer for the pre-licensing adoption training. She also assists families with their search for children by providing counseling and presenting them at various national matching conferences. As some of my listening audience may know, I have a special relationship with Paths for Families, as Paths for Families is the reason why I am a daddy today. So, Miss Clark, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. I'm so happy you're glad to be here. So, I wanted to talk to you today because you have done a lot of work, clearly, as your bio states, in the foster care system. I believe that is one of the areas, at least that's an area that I get a lot of questions about with people who have a lot of particulars about how to navigate that system. So I know you're going to be able to talk a bit about some of that today. So I'm excited about it. So, but what I want to do is I want to go a little bit back into your history. So we're going to start in 2003. Can you tell us a bit about your work as a child protection services social worker?
Sure. So I in that role, I did a lot of work with birth parents. And mainly I would say the majority of my work was working with birth families to ensure that children didn't get removed, right, from their home. Yes, there were issues that arose that caused them to get an open case, right? But it was my job to help them to mitigate those factors, mitigate those problems. Um, and I'm talking things like, unaddressed mental health, um, addiction, even domestic violence, and homelessness. So, and transients. So those are some of the, reasons, why, along with abuse, and the because it's those issues that cause, parents to pull their focus off of their kids, right? Because when you're involved in those types of things, when you have problems that you're not handling the best, right? Or you have poor, coping skills, those are the things that pull you off of parenting. And before you know it, there you have the neglect, you have the abuse. Also, a lot of it is generational. But all of it is something that we can help families, to try and get a handle on. Now, what I think the old adage is, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, right? Well, we can help as much as we can, but it is ultimately up to those parents. And so my job was to try and advocate and be a support, you know, um, help to be an advocate when having to work with different systems, the schools, you know, um, hospitals, and therapists, things of that nature. So a lot of my cases were in home cases, right? Children were in the home; they hadn't been removed.
Hmm.
Um, Sometimes they may, have to do, some type of safety plan. Where I've had cases where I've gotten grandparents to move into a home, of the parent, just so there's another set of eyes, on that child. And sometimes you can kind of, mend, or try to come up with a band-aid solution temporarily. But oftentimes I have to say, I've had to remove kids. Not much, because I was that worker that really tried to empower families. But when children have to come out, they have to come out.
Right.
Um, and then at that point, now I'm scrambling around trying to find somewhere for that child to go that's safe, right? So they can flourish, continue to flourish until they can come back home. So that involved initially, um, kids. It just, even when you removed kids, they languished in care, bouncing from, foster home to foster home. You hope to find, you know some kind of adoptive family that's willing to take the kids. I have to, it's kind of sad to think about it. Families weren't the first people that, agencies looked at many, many years ago. And so you had kids languishing in care. Well, I would say maybe about 8 years, at least from Connecticut's standpoint. I know that some initiatives hit some parts, of the US before it hits the others. But shortly after I became a DCF worker, the big push was to keep children with family or with kin, people that they already had a relationship with. So my job was always to be working on, a plan for, a child. In fact, that's part of social work today. Is, yeah, you may have that primary plan for a child, but you're always working on a concurrent plan for that child, right? A plan B.
Hmm.
So even when I was doing in-home cases, I was already asking about possible family members, or investigating, family members, to see if they might be a viable placement for a child, right? Whether
Hmm.
temporary or permanent. And then hopefully, you could, a child can go to a home where they knew the home, where they knew the people, right?
Yes.
And not to say that they didn't have problems that way, but not as much as going to, a stranger's home.
Hmm.
But I have to say, as a trainer, um, it was interesting because as a trainer, I did pre-licensing training for foster and adoptive families, right? And those were families that didn't have a relational, um, uh, or have a relation with the children that would be coming into their home. But then I also did kinship or relative training.
Hmm.
Very different, two very different types of trainings. Because once you know a person and you know their backstory, you tend to really come in with preconceived notions,
Mm.
right? And I'm not saying that, regular foster and adoptives, they come in with the same preconceived notions too. But your family can be a lot harder on you, or they can be too easy on you. So it's a very different type of training, when you're doing kinship and relative training, at
Mhm.
least when I had to do it. Um, But a lot of those placements would hold,
Okay.
right? So it was a good thing. And I mean, that's still the push. That's still a national push today, is when children cannot go back to their parents, that they go somewhere that they know, that they're
Yeah.
familiar. And it can even be a teacher. That's considered a kinship, you know. At least in Connecticut, it was. It's considered because that's still someone that they know,
Right.
right? Oftentimes you'll have teachers, that will step up, to be a tip, like a foster parent for a
Yeah.
child. Um, Not always adoptive, but
Hmm.
usually foster. Now it can turn in to an adoptive placement,
Hmm.
but yeah, you'll often find um, coaches have done it,
Yeah.
people that have worked with that child,
Yes.
because once they find out what that child is going through, sometimes they'll, you know, that's their way of helping that
Of
child out.
helping.
Mhm,
I
mhm,
wanted to ask, going back to something you said in the beginning, and I think this is a point that kind of often goes under the rug, so to speak, and that is the support that you offer to birth parents prior to children being removed. I think there's the conception or the misconception rather that the Child Protective Services is called and children are automatically removed. I'm sure in some cases that may have to be the case, but it's very important to recognize that there is support even before they are removed because everything is being done to keep that child with their birth parent. Can you talk a little bit more about some of that? What that looked like for you is just in particular in dealing with the birth parent and really helping to support them?
mhm. Sure. So when as a worker, I one of the first things, in dealing with the family is first trying to get a working rapport with that family. Because let's face facts, when DCF knocks on your door or when Child Protective Services knocks on your door, nobody's happy about
Right.
it. Whether it's a regular in-home case or whether it's we're taking a child on an order of temporary custody, right there on an administrative hold. Nobody's happy about it. And so you first have to get kind of through that barrier, and get the family to understand, that you're here to help.
Yes.
You shouldn't come in there like the police. Now, investigators tended to have a different way of how they, would come on the scene. But I was what was called an ongoing services worker. So usually investigators, when they're the first on the scene when a case is open, um, they are assessing, and they usually have about 45 days to come to a decision on whether we're gonna, that case was gonna be opened, you know, or if it's gonna be closed. Now, thank goodness, today you don't have, you actually have a two-track system. Most states are now moving to a two-track system because it's found that once somebody's in there, in the family, having a discussions and finding out really what that family needs, sometimes it's just services. And so they don't even have to have an open case,
Mm,
on their record. Um, but for obviously abuse cases and more severe neglect cases, it goes to the traditional, having to have a case open. But anyway, going back to the services, so there are individual therapy, that's offered. There are parenting classes that are offered. If that parent is involved with substance abuse, there's they'll have to go through testing, regular drug tests, but there are counseling programs. There are um, even transitional housing for those that are suffering with or going through addiction, where they provide case management and treatment in a setting that will allow them, once they get to a certain point, where they, can have their children there, in transitional living. So there's all kinds of different programs that are out there. Other services, um, are things like intensive family preservation and intensive reunification programs,
Hmm.
right? So, intensive family preservation, those were programs that usually, you had, different smaller agencies, that got licensed to do that work. And what they would do is those are considered in-home services that would actually come in the home, in addition to us coming in, maybe weekly or twice a month or however. But usually these people would come in weekly to really try and do just that, keep that child from having to, be removed from the home. So they would offer like in-home counseling, case management, might refer them or hook them up with other community agencies. Um, Sometimes they'll do evaluations. It just depends on, what it is. Also, with intensive family reunification, that's when, let's say, a child had to be removed from the home. What they would do is, start working with the family in home to get that, to get the parent prepared to have that child return. Make sure they understand, what's been going on with the child while being out of their care and what services are needed. So they help to do that case management piece and do counseling. And once that child transitions back into the home, is reunified with the parent, um, then they, set up a plan, and a check-in, with them. And they usually will transition shortly after the child is reunified, or some, programs have it where they're in there maybe a month, and after
Hmm.
that, yeah. So.
Okay.
Mhm.
Wow.
And both of these programs work together with the court system as well.
Okay.
Mhm.
It just kind of warmed me a bit because I'm not the be all and end all of all of this world of fostering. And so I really just that's why I wanted to pause there, because I don't think that's a point that people know. And I really wanted to kind of give a little bit more focus to the fact that there is support prior to in some cases.
Yeah.
Now,
It
in 2013, you transferred to the foster and adoptive services division. How
mhm.
did that differ from the role that you had as a protection services? I might mess up the title here, um, but in your role at yes, as a child protection services social worker. Did you get all that?
Yes, I did. Yeah, and I wouldn't dare
Might have
make you repeat
jumbled
it
through
because
it.
it wouldn't have came out the same way, so you don't have to worry about me making you repeat it.
Oh, goodness.
Um, I know it's a lot, all
It's
these
all right.
acronyms and what have you. So it was very interesting. Somebody told me I was born for that work. Although it was a stressful job, I did enjoy working with families and children and, all the entities that they touch. But I was also, as a child protective services worker, um, you work closely with the foster parents as well, right? Because when you remove a child, well, you're the one that has to find a placement,
Mhm.
and when you find that home, you're going out there once a week, um, initially, and every state has their rules, and then maybe it's down to once or twice a month, depending on what's going on in that household. But yeah, I worked very closely with my foster parents at that level because they didn't often understand the behaviors of the children that were coming into the home.
Mhm.
I was not ever one of those workers that tried to hide any kind of behaviors that I thought was going to be challenging.
Okay.
Sometimes, you're asked not to just put that out there, but these people needed to know what they were dealing with. So I already had a good rapport. So by the time I went over to FASU, or the Foster and Adoption Services Unit, um, that's when I really got to fully understand, foster parents and adoptive parents. Why are you really doing this? You get to
Mhm.
find out reasons why. Now, obviously, because I did it all, some of the foster parents would be relatives.
Okay.
So now I'm having to do a lot of what is it? Do a lot of trying to be the mediator when we would put a child in a relative home
Mm.
because the relative would tend to want to badmouth their relative. And of course, that causes, issues in the home. And
Yes.
so, just always having to remind them about, what they were learning in training, the fact that, this is still your relative. And so you're having to do a lot of, counseling on that end.
Mhm.
Um, but I do think for the most part, and we know we've heard of families that do this for money, right? Do foster parenting for, and there are a few out there. But most of the time, people are, as far as fostering, and especially when they're taking in relatives, they are doing it for the child,
Yes.
you know, and they're doing it for their family member, especially if it's grandparents, or someone like that, or aunt, aunt and uncle of the child. And they mean well. But their thing is, I know how this person is. You don't know how they are. I've known them all my life. You got to fight against that. So
Mhm. Mhm.
sometimes those can be harder. Those families are a little harder to work with than those that clearly just don't know the family, don't know the child.
Right.
Clean slate for everyone. So I feel like those cases were a little more easier because those individuals were waiting to be told, everything about this child or everything about the process. Whereas your relatives, a lot of times seem to, take on the attitude of, oh, I don't need you to tell me anything. I know, I know, I know. So it's just, that's the difference there. I will say one of the things that, while it can be tedious, it was very interesting, was doing the licensing because you have to create a home study,
Yes.
right? And so, as you well know, when you're, looking to be matched with a child, how a child's team knows about you is through your home study.
Yes.
So it's not like you're going around knocking on doors saying, hey, I'm looking for a kid to adopt. That's not how it works. And so, it's your home study that gets sent to a child's team. And um, of course, there's very intrusive questioning that's asked, that's done, with the family, because as I always say, an agency is putting a child that they may know somewhat, but not
Yes.
all, into a home of a family that they know nothing about, and so whether it's for fostering or for adoption, you need to be detailed and you need to ask those questions. But I enjoyed licensing or writing the studies, interviewing, getting to really know the individuals, so that piece I did like. Um, and it led me to training,
Mhm.
because I did see that there were some people that, um, especially on the adoption side, sometimes weren't doing it for, I don't want to say for the right reasons, but I'll say for the right reasons.
Okay.
I'm just going to go and say that from my professional, point of view, because children need parents. Do they not need mentors? Yeah, I'm not saying they don't need mentors,
Mhm.
you know. Um, and for those that want a mentoring relationship, we need you.
Yes.
Hook up with an agency, mentor. We really do need mentors, coast to coast. But these kids need parents. And so they need someone that has the ability to put down boundaries,
Mhm.
you know, stick to a routine, you know. And we say stick to a routine, but also, be flexible when needed,
Yes.
right? And do it in a nurturing, loving way.
Mhm.
But you still need to be that parent. You're still going to have to be the one to say, no, you can't right now. Or this isn't the best thing for you. We're going to have to take this away. Or, they're going to have to, you're going to have those conversations. You're going to have to tell them about things that you may find uncomfortable, right? You're going to have that sex talk with that child, right? You're going to have, when they ask you about their parents, you know, you're going to have come up with some type of answer.
Mm.
So you have to be willing to be in a parenting role. and want to be there, and have that genuine desire. Some people do it because they want to give back. Um, yeah, but you still have to be a parent, you know, right? So what does giving back mean? What does that really mean? Some people do it as a checkoff, like, well, I feel like I've conquered everything in my life. What haven't I conquered?
Yeah.
They want to use that as a checkoff. So I said, in looking at this, I did, when the opportunity arose, I said, I would like to train because I really want families to know what these kids are really dealing with, where they come from. And one thing about Connecticut that I thought they got right, and I don't know if they still do it, but they wouldn't allow you to work in the foster and adoptive services unit if you had not been a child protective services worker first.
Okay.
And I don't know if other states did that, but they did that. And to me, I think that made all the difference in the world and helped to kind of turn, some of the problems with the child welfare in Connecticut around when they started doing that. I know that it helped me,
Yes.
right? Because I didn't come from an abused, background. I wasn't neglected. And I don't know that I even knew that there was that much abuse and neglect around until I started working for this agency and doing this
Mhm.
work. But I do feel like parents need to know, just like we work hard for the birth parents, in helping them. I think we need to, work just as hard helping foster parents and adoptive parents, to get it right when it comes to parenting. And there's no perfect parent, that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Um, but what you want to make sure and do is to be effective,
Yes.
in whatever role, you're playing.
You gave us a lot in that. That was some important nuggets. Um, One thing I want to circle back to is I can imagine it was your lived experience that really, and when I say lived, let me maybe not use the word lived, but maybe your professional lived experience that really helped to, I'm sure, make you a very effective trainer because you can speak to what you've seen on both sides. Yeah, you know what what birth parents are dealing with, what they're going through, and how to help those prospective foster parents really nurture, I would say, maybe an appropriate relationship with that child. Like you said, they do need parents. And I'm glad you said that because I don't think that that's really something that comes up a lot is that while we want people with great hearts, the bottom line of it is what the child needs at that moment is a parent. And I honestly, I've never heard anyone say that. And I don't know why that's not blatantly obvious, but I'm glad that you pointed that out. And so, kind of going back to the foster parents, because we did talk about the supports that birth parents had. What are some of the supports that foster parents have? So you also, and I don't want to pile too much on. I remember you said in the beginning when you were working with child protective services, not all the time did the foster parent have all of the information up front. We know that could be problematic, but all of that said, and kind of having that lingering in the back of our minds, what are the supports that are offered to foster parents?
And that's a good question. Things are ever changing, so it's been a while since I've been on that end. But the public agency that the foster parents are licensed through, there are a lot of things that can be helpful. Sometimes you just don't know to ask, right? They there are support groups, right? So there's support groups for foster parents. A lot of times they don't. I think we think of um, birth parents as needing support groups, and there's adoptive, but they even have support groups for foster parents. And most states have some type of agency that is a support agency for foster parents. I know in Connecticut it was KFAC, and I think it was the Connecticut Association of Foster and Adoptive Parents, right? So most states have a support agency or association for foster parents. And it really is up to that department, that through that worker to keep, uh, well, not through the child's worker, but through the foster parents worker, to keep them connected and get them connected to agencies like that,
Can
right?
I pause you right there because you said something there that's another very important factor. So there's a worker for the child and then a separate worker for the parent. I didn't know that part.
Mhm,
Okay. All
mhm.
right. So
So, and
okay.
that's what I was doing once I changed and went over to the foster care and adoption side. That's when I became a worker for the foster parent. When I was on the CPS side, I was a worker for the child and family, birth family. Yeah.
Wow. So then I'm assuming then based on that, then that support, because that I would regard as a support, is something that stays the entire duration the child is in the home. So then that parent should be able to reach out to their own worker if they need support. So, and do those two workers work together?
They're supposed to.
Okay.
Right? So they are supposed to. Yeah.
Hmm.
Once again, different states do things differently. But there's always okay. So there's always uh, policy.
Hmm.
Whether it's state policy, and procedures and federal policies. But there's also that agency has policies of their own for that department. And then there's something that's just called good social work practice. And so those are things that may not be written down, but these are things that you should just know to do,
Mm.
right? So if you have a child that's in a home that you licensed and you're the support worker for that foster parent or that, adoptive parent, foster parent, then you should want to know occasionally about that child and the agency's department's plan for that child. So you always want to be able to meet, and even if you don't do like joint, visits together, I always used to every now and again do a joint visit with the child's worker. And I did that for two reasons. One, just to, like I said, make sure I knew the plan for the child so that I could counsel, when I would make my home visits to the foster parent, that I, just kind of reiterate some of the things that I know that they need to be doing for that
Mhm.
child, right? But the other reason why I did that is once you become a foster parent, it's not that your life's not your own, but now you have people coming in and out your home,
Yes.
right? And it just makes it one less, appointment that you have to make. So sometimes I would do those types of things to make it easier for that foster parent. You know, now you can talk to both of us. You don't have to do two separate visits, right? Because we're essentially talking to the same people, you know.
Yes.
When I would go to talk to the foster parent, I would also take time to talk to the child, you know. Now, I wouldn't take the child off site and go spend time. Oftentimes, the CPS workers, when they do a visit, they may, take that child off, and do
Oh,
something with them.
okay.
Because children tend to talk better when they're away from who they want to talk
That makes sense.
about, right? So I've taken many a trip, having to go to many a restaurant, to talk with the child. So, but yeah, as a support for the foster parent, um, there is a difference, but you do keep in contact with that worker. It's very important. Um, and for things like, and then sometimes the inevitable happens where a report is called in on that foster parent, sometimes by the child may make a false report because they're upset, and that can happen even in the birth home.
Yes.
But when it happens there, it is really taken seriously because there's a special investigations unit that handles investigations or allegations when it involves a foster adoptive parent. Well, I should say a foster or pre-adoptive parent,
Okay.
or an agency that's run, by a CPS agency. those entities. When there's a report that comes in, they take it seriously. But yeah, to just be a support, really that's what you're doing. You're being a support for that foster parent. If you see that that foster parent needs extra training, um, it's the foster parent's worker that should, suggest maybe webinars or a conference. Or if we see that the foster parent is maybe struggling with something emotionally, to refer for counseling, individual counseling. So yeah, those are some of the things that we do
And
along along with making sure, just like when I would do home visits, um, you do a walkthrough of the home just to make sure. Trust me, I've had boyfriends hiding in closets and all kinds of things. So when you do visits, on the birth family inn, you're doing those visits, doing those walkthroughs, but also with the foster families. A lot of times we get, we get lax and we feel like, oh, they're fine because they're the safe family. Yeah,
yes.
they're safe till you find out they're not safe. Because I've had to remove children from foster parents. I've had children two times I've had to remove children because of that. And you would never know, that abuse was happening. So it's but you're there as a support, but you're also there assessing every time you do a visit.
And so to dig a bit, because I feel like, because it kind of, I almost think, goes together. To dig a little bit more into the training part, which would really be a part of that home study, it's a requirement as a part of the home study. What are some of the things that you are tackling? Because I would also assume that a lot of that training is really a support in and of itself. You're gaining knowledge and kind of finding out resources. What are some of those things that are commonly discussed in those trainings?
So for foster parents, because it is just slightly different. I mean, it's the
Yes.
same training, but there's slight differences. When we're dealing with foster parents, so what's the same across the board are things like um, communication. Knowing how to communicate, with children, right? Understanding the effects of trauma, right, on a child, and understanding that when things have happened, it's going to play out in their behavior, right? Um, but that you can link that back to how they feel.
Yes.
If a child's been, sexually abused, well, how would a child feel about that? What do you think a child is feeling, about that? And then once you can determine how you think they might be feeling, you can understand that behavior that they have a little bit better, instead of being so punitive, in the way that we handle the behaviors. So we talk about that, the appropriate ways, to set consequences. And um, also, we talk about grief and loss. And grief and loss and separation were things that weren't talked about, believe it or not, in a lot of trainings some many years ago. I don't know why, but the mentality then was, oh, let's save the child. Let's pull them out the home. And now they're safe with us. We don't have to deal with those bad people anymore. Right. And
Hmm.
we thought that by doing that, that would just erase everything in that child's mind, and not understanding that it's quite the opposite oftentimes.
Hmm.
It's very traumatic to come into foster care.
Yes.
You're in different homes that don't smell like your home. Food doesn't taste like the food you're used to. You, whether you're being abused or neglected, on purpose, by accident, it really doesn't matter. If that child has a connection, to their caregiver, they're going to miss them, right? Kids go to school every day. They see teachers and friends. They don't get to, they miss those. They might have had a pet. They can't bring that pet with them into foster care most of the time. So they lose so much, and they lose each time they go from home to home to home. And it's traumatic.
Yes.
It's even traumatic just talking about it, if you ask me, you know. Um, and so, it's talking about the grief, and the loss, and allowing those children to grieve and loss. Grieve, they need to grieve. And that grieving is not necessarily pretty.
Yeah.
You know, we talk about racial disparities, right? And being culturally competent.
Yes.
Um, we talk about we talk about school issues. A lot of these children lag behind, and sometimes developmentally, they have some
Yes.
delays and deficits that were never met. And
Can I
so,
pause right there for a little bit? Because that's an important thing right there. How can, and I don't want to, so we're talking about training, but I don't want to lose this when we talk about the school part. How can, or what are the support, how can foster parents support their children when it comes to school? Because I don't know that all foster parents know their rights. Like, can you show up to the team meeting? What is the say that you have? Do you have any say as it pertains to the IEP? What are some other supports when it comes to that child's um, academic life?
and that's a good question, right? Because kids spend at least 6 hours a day, in school, if not longer sometimes. But um, and it's very important, for parents to be involved in their children's education across the board, whether you're a birth family, yeah, birth parent, foster parent, or adoptive. So, and some of this may differ slightly state to state, right? But in general, if that child is in your home, you have the right to ask to be present at an IEP or an educate well at a PPT. So different states call them something different. So we'll just call it the IEP meeting,
Yes.
for yeah, lack of a term. And so the IEP, for those that might not know, that's an individualized education plan. And that's used when a child needs special education service.
Hmm.
It's something that is their goals, that are on there that are achievable goals for a child, and they need to be measurable goals, and it is reviewed, on a annual basis. But it's not if there's changes that need to be made, you can always call a meeting to get, changes to, for the group, the team, the IEP team to come together to, talk about this plan, and because we want this child to succeed.
And the
And
foster
every
parent
season
can
is
do
not,
that.
and so they can when they're talking with the teacher, they can ask for one, but really, um, what they'll need to do is, because it's not like they're a pre-adoptive parent, but what you would do is tell the worker, hey, you know, um, I've been trying to, work with the teacher and the school, to do X, Y, and Z with Johnny, but they're just not doing it. And I think that he needs more service, right? And so the worker would then, approach the school. Now, in some, school districts, they may allow that foster parent, to actually, if they ask for a PPT meeting, I mean, IEP meeting, they may, pull one together, but or at least a meeting you know, uh, for that parent to come in and that child to come in. And at that point, it would be if I were the foster parent, I would ask the worker to be present. Now, going back to that, there's something called an educational surrogate. Some states call it a surrogate parent. But what that is it is a person who has expertise in the educational system. A lot of times it's, principals or ex-principals or superintendents or teachers that have been in the education system for some time and know how it works. Um, and so what they do is they're the actual person that's responsible for that child's education, meaning that liaison between, that child and, the school. Um, they're the ones that can call a PPT at any time. They're the ones that actually have to call a PPT. They're paper-wise. They're the ones that have to be present. They're the ones that, and this is when it's an official IEP meeting. If it's just a school meeting to discuss, that's a little
Yes.
different. But for an actual IEP meeting, they have to be present.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they are ones that if the parent's not present, the worker's not present, they can do everything. And oftentimes when children have been in care for a while, hopefully they kind of have the same, surrogate parent if they have special ed services that follows them, so they know. I know now since COVID, staffing has been down in a lot of schools. And so I know that there have been cases where I've had children um, that are in pre-adoptive homes, and the surrogate parent that was assigned, it like changes, almost every few months. But in general, if you have, a good one,
Mm-hmm.
they're there, they know the child, they can speak to that child's performance and what that child needs. They'll push that school to allow that child to stay and really hold schools' feet to the fire. They're responsible for meeting the needs of that child, educational needs of that child. Now, if they truly cannot, then that means a discussion about moving that child to a school where that child's needs can be met. They're also really good if, they're trying to kick the child out of school, and you feel like the school hasn't really done enough to ask for, this child to be expelled. Or if maybe the child had an incident, a fight or something, and they want to expel that worker, that uh, surrogate parent can intercede. Now, out here, I know that things are a little bit different. In Connecticut, when a child came into foster care, they automatically got a surrogate if it was deemed that they um, had an IEP already,
Okay.
right? Now, if they didn't, like I said, if it was initial, if it was an initial IEP, then you have an initial IEP meeting. Um, Here, they have educational surrogates, but I know for the adoptive parents, pre-adoptive parents that are working with a private agency, they have to pay for that. Now they're good, they're excellent, and there are educational attorneys that can operate the same, so they kind of working in tandem. But yeah, there are educational surrogates that are out there that the state provides when
That
a
so
child's
there are
in
some.
foster care. Mhm.
Okay. All right. And so I wanted to pause there, and we were still talking about that training. So we left off at education. Any other parts that you want to add to that training?
Yeah, so and let's go back to talking about school.
Okay.
One of the things that I think is a great thing to do is for that foster parent to make sure they show up at school, right? Make sure that they know who, Miss So and so is. Well, this is Johnny's, foster parent, Mr. or Miss So and so. And you want them to know that you're vested in that child's education, no matter how long that child's going to be in the home, whether it's a week or whether it's 2 years, or it doesn't matter. So if they see that that child's parent is taking an interest, then they'll take an interest in your child. You know, I also think that it is wise for foster parents to get a really good understanding of how a child behaves in school. What is that child's history of behavior in school, so they, don't get, blindsided. Is this a child that you're going to get a couple of calls a week? Let that foster parent know. So, also, I would say for foster parents, oftentimes when a child has had a visit with birth family, sometimes how they behave after may not be the greatest. There may be some retriggering, some re traumatization. Or it could be, I don't want to be in your home. I want to go to my mom's house. So they may wake up that next morning not in such a good mood. Call the teacher, give the teacher a heads up and say, hey, we kind of had a situation this morning. I'm not sure, how Johnny is going to be, how he's going to react in school, but please give me a call if there's, anything that you think I should need to know. You might not want to be, um, you might not want to, how is it? What's the word I want to say? Maybe this needs to be a low key day for Johnny. Let's not call on him for a question
Mm-hmm.
because he's really not feeling it today.
Yeah.
You know, it's when everyone can work as a team. And when I talk about a child's team, I'm talking about the worker. I'm talking about the workers. I'm talking about the supervisor, the therapist involved with the child. I'm talking about if the child's in a group home um, setting, the clinicians, any kind of services that that child, is involved in. Those people are part of the team. The school is part of the team. And when I talk about the school, if this child has special education, then it's a special education teacher, the school social worker, the school psychologist, right? All of these people are part of a team. Also, that goes back to, which is they're certainly important, the state where that child comes from, that child's worker and team, and people that have worked with that child. So in cases of adoption, and the that child is in your home on pre-adoptive status, that means the adoption is not finalized.
Mm-hmm.
That's essentially you're a pre-adoptive foster parent. So those people are part of that team. When everybody is on the same, when everybody is informed and is communicating, then it makes things move so much smoother for that child.
You
You
know
don't
what?
have to worry about the foster parent telling the child one thing, teacher saying something else, clinician saying something else. Everyone is on the
On the
same.
same page. You know what you spoke to though is, and we're not really here to have that kind of discussion, but you've spoken to a broader situation in terms of school in general and the role that every parent must have, because that goes lacking on both sides. But it also goes back to what you said, that the children need a parent.
Mhm.
So then when you are a parent, that is your responsibility to show up to the school, to be informed, to be very vested. Because again, as you said, if the school knows that you're going to be there, they operate a little different.
They sure do.
So I like that. So you really gave a great precursor to that in saying first and foremost, a child needs a parent. And this is a part of the responsibility of the parent. So that is that's critical. Um,
And one of the things, let me just say that one of the things
sure.
I always used to tell my foster parents, why would you have a child in your home and you don't know anything about their schooling? How can you have a child in your home and you don't know what homework they have? You should want to know how they're doing in school. Why would you have a child in your home where you're asking the worker to take him to the pediatrician? No, you need to take him to the pediatrician. You should want to know about the health of your child. So that was often the conversation I had with my.
That's critical. I want to, and really that covered a lot in terms of the just general that whole work as a social worker, and in both areas in terms of the child protective services, and moving on to the other side where you were in the foster and adoptive services division. And so moving up a little bit, and some of this might still apply, I'm sure. You are now with Paths for Families exclusively. Well, you'll give us a little bit more. I almost want to say exclusively in a training capacity, but I feel like it might be a little broader than that. And just to give some context, we've done a lot of talking about what happens on the public side of of foster care, but now we're in a private agency, and so I'm sure it has to look a little different in terms of how things operate. for lack of a better term. But let's talk a bit about your role there as a trainer and what you're doing.
So it's so funny. So that's not my primary role. It's my happy place role, right?
Ah,
So my role is as a foster care adoption specialist, and in that role, what I do is I support families. Now, initially, when I got hired, um, I helped I helped families to search for children, right? And so I would, send out the home studies when they wanted, or were interested in a child. I would be the one to send out home studies. And then also when a team was interested in a particular family, then we start doing that real work, right? And that when I say real work, that means now it was my job to start and find out more about this kid. Because when you are on these child search websites, they speak about the strengths of the child, right? Oh, little Johnny is happy go lucky, likes the outdoors, and he likes chicken nuggets and fries. You know,
yeah.
that kind of thing. They don't tell you that this is a child that's very hyperactive, is on medication, is very impulsive, has, anger issue. You don't get all of that. So it's my job once a team is interested in a family after reading their home study, that is when we start having meetings together. Like I would, contact, public agencies and say, hey, can you give me a child profile, on Johnny? Hey, we need more details. And sometimes it's worker to worker. Other times I was able to bring the family, into it, and we could have calls, after reading a little bit more about the child, and ask those questions that they don't readily, tell you, right? I look at things, I used to look at, okay, this is what you're saying is the child's diagnosis, but this list of medications says there's so much more there. And then that, once I brought that up, then, you start having a different conversation.
Mm,
It was my job to, and I always say this, um, it's not enough for you to tell me that a child can be aggressive. Okay. Well, I want to know how often. What are the circumstances when they are aggressive? What does what does that aggression look like in this child? So those are the questions that we ask. We're trying to pull out as much as we can about that child so that a family can, make an informed decision
yes.
as to if they want, to move forward with the child. So I work with public agencies, for the child on that. And then, um, well, and in that role, I would also present families at what's called virtual match events.
Okay.
Um, and that was a video call where you'd have, and different states would have them, where you have the workers for the children present their children, and talk all about, you know, uh, Tommy and Sally and anybody else. And then all of us adoption specialists would get on the phone and talk about our families that are available. And sometimes you can get matches that way as well.
Okay.
So I did some of that, which I still continue to do. All of this that I'm talking about, I still continue to do because that's my main job here working for this agency. Although now we have someone that's doing the pre-match. So now I'm going to talk about once a family gets matched with a child, and there's a whole process behind that. It's a teaming. It's not one person chooses, but there's a teaming that goes on. So once a child's team decides, that one of our families is, the family that is going to be matched with the child, then I come on the scene and I'm now what's called a pre-match. I used to do it all, but now I do pre-match. And so post-match. So as a post-match um, specialist, I work on the contracts that need to be in place before a child can transition. right? So there's an entity called the Interstate Compact Office. Every state has one. And really their prime purpose, sole purpose really, is to make sure that when children that are wards of a state, that when they change residency to another state, that whatever services they were receiving um, in their home state, in foster care in their home state, they have to, make sure that they're receiving that in, the receiving state, right? So that's all contractual, and there are a lot of other different types of contracts that go with it. So I'm responsible for making sure that those are in place, doing contract negotiations, and just making sure that that process moves on. It sounds easy, but sometimes it can be pretty long and tedious from the time a family is matched to when that child actually gets placed in the home. And so a child has to be in the home, placed in that pre-adoptive home for 6 months before an adoption can be finalized.
Okay.
And that's coast to coast. It's a federal, that's under a federal statute.
And
And
sorry.
during that 6 months, our agency is, because that family is licensed through our agency, it is our agency um, who provides the support and comes in once a month. We have licensed clinical social workers that write the studies. That same person that wrote the home study is the same person that goes into the home and once a month to do a home visit and talks with the child, talks with the family. Um, we'll initiate a referral. They'll call me and say, "Hey, this family needs X, Y, and Z." Um, I do crisis intervention, so that means just what it sounds like.
Mm,
When there is a crisis, when a family's having a problem
yes.
or challenge, they can call me, and we try to help mitigate. So that's what
N-
we do.
Now, let me ask this. So, given that with this role, you're at a private agency, the status of the children, I'm assuming it's a bit different than it would be. Yes, they're technically in foster care, but the difference would be that parental rights have already been terminated when
That's
they
correct.
are specifically with your agency. Yeah.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay.
And that's the only way that children can be adopted.
Mm-hmm.
Is parents' rights have to be terminated. And there was one thing that I left off. I was telling you there was a little difference in the training. So when you train uh, for foster parents, you also have to have a strong focus on, and you do have to have a focus with adoption, but there's a strong focus on birth family involvement because the big push now is for foster parents and birth parents to really work together, right? Um, so that if that child does transition, that it's that foster parent that's really helping to prepare that child to transition back to their
Okay.
parents. Or if it's that, that child will have to go elsewhere, that foster parent still, is there for the parent and the child. So it's a very, we're now understanding the importance of keeping a child tied to their birth family connections. Now on the adoption side, they were a little slow to catch on, and some people still don't like it. Right? With adoptive parents, they're like, I got the child I'm running. Forget these people. But
Really?
yeah, but really, yeah, very much so. That was when you adopted. That meant you didn't have to deal with any birth parents.
And I
No,
know that was a thing of a, well, I guess not. I was assuming was a mentality of the past more than the present.
no, there's
Um,
still people out there that they hear it. We teach it, right? So when I just recently, you know, um, I think my last class that I taught, because I've been a trainer, up until this point, for pastor families as well. But I think that even though we teach what we teach, people still have the mentality of I'm going to raise this child child the way that I want to raise them. So they don't really listen to everything that's being told. Other people feel like, oh, they're just giving us the worst case scenario, but that's not it. That is not, what I was giving them. I was telling them, you may very well see these behaviors, and I want you to be prepared when you see them. You may not see them now, but you may see them 2 years later. Who knows? And so it's just getting them to understand that. And one of the hardest things for them is, and what's taught on the foster care side, is empathy, right? And adoptive parents tend not to have any empathy for the birth family. And when you don't have empathy on that end, then you don't understand where that child is coming from. I always, when I taught, always said, you are additions to this child's family. You are not replacements. You're not here to replace parents.
Right.
That is not your role as an adoptive parent. You are here as an addition. Their birth parents don't cease to be their birth parents just because their rights are terminated. That's a legal term, that's a legality, right? But that doesn't change the fact that these people are this child's parents. And nothing you can do can erase that. It can't erase that from their minds or their hearts. But what you can do is be a good addition. You are now another set of parents, that, have, good boundaries. You can teach good coping skills. You can be loving and nurturing, and you can move that child, forward in life. So I try to get them to understand that you are an addition, not a replacement. And you can always tell, everyone's always on board, but you can always tell when it gets close to matching. I because I also am the one that does their program meeting. So after the home study is done and they move into that search match, placement portion, um, they have a 2-hour meeting with me, where we talk about the particulars. And one of the things that I tell them is, you need to understand that, if you are not willing to keep this child connected to birth family and to culture, then you stand a chance of not getting picked for a child. So you have to make sure that that is something that you're willing to do, because this child's agency is going to ask, what are you going to do to keep this child connected to your culture? What are you its culture? What are you going to do to keep this child connected to their birth family? Can this child still maintain a relationship with the grandparent? They have one now. Can that continue? What's that going to look like? So that's, and when we see, sometimes you see families stumbling, and other times, families are okay with it.
Yeah.
But it's very important because it's part of that child's identity.
And and kind of digging into that a bit more, um, I don't know figures, I don't know if you do, but transracial adoption is a big thing. And so that's when you're talking about the cultural, staying connected to the culture, we're talking about transracial adoption, which means that a child of a different race, the parents and the children are different races, different cultures. I think I'm summing that up correctly. Am I right on that? Did I word it correctly?
Yes,
And
yes.
so it is so important, and what you're saying is vital, that that child still identified with exactly who they are. No parent is coming in to remove any of that. That should never be the case. And so I really wanted to dig into that a bit more, because you said that, and it's so important that they understand that, along with
Hmm.
um the support, or how you all, the both birth parent and adoptive parent, kind of carve your pathway forward. And I'm sure it looks different for every family, but as long as there is some path forward. And you said, I spoke with an adoptee, and the language that you just used is the same language that she used, in terms of that birth parent will forever be. And that's how I recognize my son's birth parents. Um, because for me, and I look at it a little differently, if it were not for them, I would not have my child. So I can never
Exactly.
erase the individuals who created my biggest blessing. I could not erase that. I would not. And actually, and maybe to some people this sounds weird, I absolutely adore my son's birth parents. It was automatic. It was very weird for me. It caught me off guard that I automatically adored them. But again, how could I not? And then I also say this because I think that this is something that is under recognized, that for the birth parent as well, this is a trauma. Not all birth parents, people have this misconception of birth parents that they just didn't want to do this.
Conception.
And the thing of it wasn't that they didn't want to do it, but they felt that there was something a little bit more that someone else could offer that they could not. So they did this. This was love. This was to me one of the greatest sacrifices any parent could make, to do this. So you don't enter into this way. And so to dismiss and to vilify, all of those things can never, ever happen. To my mind, the adoptive parent must always celebrate that. You must sell. I don't care what the circumstance, because you're talking more about fostering. So then that means that um, that child might have spent a more extensive bit of time with the birth parent. They have a relationship. So no matter what it was that was the circumstance that caused them to be removed, we still have to have our children love and
Yes.
respect that parent.
Yes, yes. And I think it's so funny that you say that. And I think it's because you happen to be wired for um it's just the way that you're wired that you're able to understand you that you have that feeling for your son's birth parents. But in general, people don't. They always look so odd. And I remember I had this one, uh parent, it was a couple, and she was from another country, and she said, "Empathy for them? For the birth parents?" She just couldn't even understand that. They shouldn't have done what they did. They should not have, you know. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So, it makes for a long conversation. But I always tell people don't wake up one morning and say, you know what? I think that I'm going to go and get pregnant so that I can abuse a child. That's not what they do. This is not
No.
what it is. Once again, people get caught up. Life, as they say now, life is life and life
Yes.
be life. But
Yes.
things happen in their lives. Everyone doesn't have the same coping skills. And once get involved in things like addiction and maybe unaddressed, or I should say self-medicating for a mental illness, or whatever the case may be, you just it pulls your attention away from parenting. You end up not being a good parent, and before you know it, you're not even there at all. And things happen. A phone call is made, and here you are. You
Yes.
know, um, and sometimes it's just the whole culture that they were raised in. And when I say culture, just that family's culture, right? If you were born into a family that was gang involved to begin with, well, I mean, it's hard to get out of that life. So it's it's not easy. It's not
Mhm.
easy for these parents, but it doesn't mean that they don't love their children. I mean,
Yes.
I used to have to take kids to prisons to visit their dads and moms, um, for visits, because when
Mhm.
kids are in foster care, they still get to have visits with their parents wherever
Mhm.
they are. I've had them done at the shelter, because it's to maintain that bond, that
Yes.
connection that they have, that's
Yes.
going to always be there. And to get people on the adoptive, side to understand that,
Mhm.
sometimes it's a little bit more
Little
difficult.
different.
Um, but some are very good at it. Others, like I say, you gotta drag them along, kicking and screaming. But I will say that is a determining factor as to if people don't get
Okay.
chosen or matched, because children's agencies are looking for people that are willing to work with those birth families, at least keep the siblings connected.
Yes.
you know? Um, yeah.
And I think I felt that on the private side of things, I felt that that was a huge thing that was a part of our training as well. So I love the fact that there is that still that because again, I think people think foster care, they think a little differently. There's just so many misconceptions, and that's what we want to dispel and having this kind of conversation. And what I want to do is you have good Lord, you've given a master class, and I could sit here a whole nother hour, but that probably wouldn't be good for either one of us. Because I feel like you've given so much, and I feel like I have 50,000 more questions to ask. But
I have so much information to tell you, but I'm trying to,
well, your gifting is in training, so you're training all of us, and we can see. Hopefully, our listeners can hear the love you have for the training and pouring into prospective foster and adoptive parents. What I want to ask you is more of a general kind of question that may step outside of what we've talked about. And I always say to my audience, I want there should be a takeaway for everybody. So you don't have to be a foster parent, an adoptive parent, but I always want there to be an awareness of this of this world, as I call it. But just as a general thing, what is the thing that burns in your spirit? What is the thing that's you want to sprinkle on people that you feel is necessary and really adding to a healthy and loving culture? Right. I just went into something, right?
Yeah, I'm like, geez. Well, I'm gonna narrow this down to foster
Okay.
adoption.
Sure. That's fine.
Well, because it holds,
Hmm.
holds true. So one of the things that people say that they love about my training is because I bring in so many examples and that I'm very transparent. I'm a parent. Now my parents, I wasn't, my kids weren't in foster care, but I was a parent and I didn't always get it right. 'Cause I didn't have this job, when I first had my kids. I wish I did. I would have parented them a little differently, right? Um, and I loved on them and I did things for them. So it wasn't, that piece. But I realized that I tried to parent both of my girls the same because I didn't want it to look like I was favoring one over the other. But I really needed to parent my younger one differently, slightly differently. And I also needed to be more present. By the time I had my second daughter, I I didn't have this job yet, but at some crucial point, like around middle school, I was working as a social worker, right? And so that means long hours, working on the weekends. She was involved in things, and I'm working double time, to do that. But I wasn't always there, right? I was physically there, but I wasn't always mentally there. And I needed to spend more of that time and being more attuned to her. I wasn't as attuned to her as I was my oldest. So I bring a lot of transparency and mistakes that I make in my training. And I bring in examples of the things that I'm talking about because I really want people to understand that number one, you may have to parent differently. Like these kids that are coming in here with 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 layers of things that even adults haven't even experienced, right? So you need to understand that you have to parent those children differently, maybe than you parented your own, or maybe the way you were parented. People. A lot of my families, when I'm doing crisis intervention, well, I don't believe in taking the hands off approach. I said it's not a hands off approach, but it also doesn't have to be a put hands on approach either,
Right.
right? It's staying relational. It's about parenting relationally, and staying connected and being nurturing. And so when you do that, you're not punitive. You're not focusing on consequences. You're looking at, okay, how am I emotionally feeling now? Is what this child just did or said to me, did it trigger me? Then maybe I need to step back and address this maybe tomorrow at a time when I am no longer triggered. It's making those conscious, intentional decisions as far as parenting. I wish I would have done that with my own. And if I would say anything, it's try to stay in relationship with your children. I do think now as a society, we're getting better with that. We're paying attention and focusing more on, mental health, setting boundaries and things of that nature. Um, so I think that is good. I think it's good. And we need to have more talks with our children. It doesn't need to be do what I say do, and do it now. When we make mistakes, we need to apologize to our children, right? We don't like to do that,
Right.
you know, but we need to do that because you know what? You want them to be able to mimic that.
Yes.
They need to see you take accountability for your actions, right? Or things that you have said out of anger or done. You know, um, they need to see you do it. You can't just tell them what to do. You have to show them what to do. And I just think that we need to do we need to be more intentional in our parenting. And I'm not saying that I didn't have a good mom. I thought my mom was great. Um, I did. Thought I wish I could have been like her, but she also was not, I knew she loved me, she did things to show me that she loved me, and so I knew that. But she was not one to be messed with. And oftentimes when you're like that, your kids don't come to you. And so my kids, it's interesting, my kids saw me as that type of parent to some degree. Meanwhile, every teenager on my caseload had no problem telling me things that I was like, la, 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 la. I didn't want to hear it, but they wanted to tell me details about
Mhm.
escapades, about this, that, and the other. But my own kids didn't necessarily see it. So it's really paying attention and being attuned, being a parent that can tell when their child is upset, really upset, can tell when that child is, sad, and you want to create an environment that will, this is something that I teach in my training. You want to create an environment in your household whereby kids can't wait to get home to tell you about their day or come to tell you about what's bothering them.
Yeah.
You don't want to create an environment where they're saying, well, I can't talk to my mom about that. And they're going to talk to teacher, coach, anybody else they can, other people's parents. They should be coming to talk to you. You need to create an environment in your household where your child feels comfortable enough to talk to you about race, about their identity, about their whatever social issues are going on, about any mistreatment they've experienced. They shouldn't be fearful to come to their own parent, whether it's a foster, adoptive, or birth parent, about the things that are bothering them. So that is what I'd like to leave. And I will say this, and I said it on actually on Channel 4 News. Um, I want people to know that yes, we are in need of foster and adoptive parents. We need you. Coast to coast, we're really in a deficit. We need you. But we do need you to be committed, dedicated, have the ability to love on these kids unconditionally, right? So if they slash your tires, you can't be coming to bring these kids back. There's no backseas, So whatever the kids are going through, unconditionally means you're gonna hang in there, right? So we do need that, but whatever you can do, even if it's mentoring, but we do need foster and adoptive parents, and you can do this. You may think that you cannot, but you can. You may have to do it afraid. You may have to do it,
Mhm.
a little unsure, but you can do it. How many more things do we do when we're afraid? You know? Um, and I'll leave you with this last thing. One of the most successful families to me are families that have a support network. And if they don't have a large support network, they at least are willing to reach out to all of the agencies and providers that are in their life. So if you really want to be successful, use your support, get a support system, and make sure you use them, but also don't be afraid to reach out to all of the entities that, that you'll be involved with, because everyone's going to be willing to help. Trust and believe. When you have these children in the home, don't, if you're a foster parent, don't be afraid to call the worker. And don't be afraid to go up the chain. If the worker's not being responsive, go to the supervisor, go to the program manager, right? Because there are agencies out there that will help, nonprofit agencies that'll help you, but your own public agency will help. And if you need to go up the chain, then go up the chain, all the way up to the ombudsman if you have to. But reach out. And if you're an adoptive parent as well, reach out. Yeah, reach out. Talk to your pediatrician. You'd be surprised. Those pediatricians have resources as well. Therapists have resources. So
Yes.
anyone that's involved, in your case, ask, advocate.
So you really did speak to everyone. You didn't even intend to do it, but you did, because those were important nuggets for all of us that are parents. And whether we are adoptive parents or we're birth parents, these are important things because the same things apply when you are a parent in
Yes.
general. Allison, thank you so much for joining and really pouring all of this stuff out, because it really was a lot. It's very valuable. And I know that any and everyone can take so much from it. Um, as a part of the introduction, everyone has heard that you are a part of Paths for Families. So if there's anyone who is wanting to reach out to Allison, they can find her at Paths for Families. If you're looking for support, um, Paths for Families offers a bunch of that. So the website for Paths to Families will be in the description of today's interview, so that you can reach out and ask, because that was huge, and ask. So as it is my custom, all of you who are listening today, I want you to know that adoption changes lives and brings worlds together. Thank you so much for joining us today. I look forward to speaking with you the same time, same place next Friday. Talk real soon. Bye.